the web is not in great health. A lot of things that we use in the digital world on a day-to-day basis are just broken. The web is a lot of the time much worse in terms of user experience and reliability and all of these things. And I want to do my bit to try and reverse that trend. You know, a lot of people candidly just don't have time for the front-end industry's bullshit. Oh, which library am I supposed to use for state management? No, it should be built in.
What makes a web framework not just good, but great? And how does Svelte rank consistently highest in developer satisfaction surveys? And what will future versions of Svelte bring to the web? I sat down with the creator of Svelte, Rich Harris, in his Brooklyn apartment to discuss the magic of Svelte, the current state of the web, and how we can move things forward with the right approach.
Rich, thanks for having us.
Thanks for coming by. You saved me a subway trip by coming here.
Perfect. So what problem does Svelte solve?
Svelte solves the fundamental problem is that web development is too hard. And Svelte is an attempt to make it a little bit easier, to make it a little bit more tractable for a wider group of people to build rich, interactive web applications. It falls into this category of things called a front-end framework, similar to projects like React and Vue and Angular and all of these other things. Takes a slightly different tack, but that is essentially what it does. It allows you to build your application out of declarative components, and then it turns it into something that the browser understands and allows you to build interactive UIs without having to do all of the plumbing of manipulating the DOM yourself.
You've described it as a web framework, as a framework without the framework, and as a language. Like, why is that important, and what do you mean by that?
Yeah, the definitions and the way that we talk about it have definitely evolved over the years. The framework without a framework description was when Svelte first came out. The idea was like, can we just do away with all of the machinery that is included as part of the framework when it runs in the browser? Can we take your input and just sort of compile it down to the underlying instructions to the browser and sort of dissolve away all of the scaffolding? And so that's what framework without the framework means. In reality, of course, there is a little bit of infrastructure that needs to be there for any of this to work. But essentially what it's getting at is this idea that the code that you write and the code that actually runs in the browser, they're not the same thing. There is a transformation that takes place at build time so that the application that you actually ship to users is more efficient. It's smaller than it needs to be otherwise. It's better at updating the DOM in a very efficient way. And it does all this without you needing to think deeply about how to optimize your application. It does it for you. So Svelte, in addition to being a framework, is a language. It is a language for describing user interfaces. When you build a Svelte application, you're doing it in a .svelte file as opposed to in a .js or .ts file. And that is the fundamental difference.
What do you see as the difference between a JavaScript framework and a web framework?
Yeah, it's a subtle distinction. I guess the reason that we call it a web framework as opposed to a JavaScript framework, it's kind of twofold. Firstly, Svelte is an HTML-centric language. You know, what we've found over the years is that HTML is actually a really good language for describing user interfaces. There's something about the nature of those angle brackets that people just really get. Like, you're describing the structure of something in a way that intuitively makes a lot of sense. And what we've seen is that JavaScript-centric frameworks, like React to be a great example, in order to make that style of development appealing, they've had to create things like JSX so that it feels like you're writing HTML. Okay. Svelte doesn't do that. It says HTML is actually a really good starting point. We just need to make HTML an interactive language. And so that is what Svelte is. It adds interactivity to HTML. The other reason that we call it a web framework and not a JavaScript framework is that anytime you build a web app, you're going to have to think about styling. That is one of the fundamental problems that you are going to have to solve. And a JavaScript-centric framework typically just doesn't have any opinion on this. But Svelte does. If you write a Svelte file, then you can include your CSS directly inside that component, and it will only apply to that component. And then your build tool will, extract it out and chunk it up and do all of the optimization stuff that you shouldn't need to care about. But you are describing the styles at the same time as you're describing the markup of your component and the behavior of your component. And a lot of frameworks just sort of leave that as a exercise left to the reader type thing. and that's not what Svelte's philosophy is. Svelte's philosophy is, you're building a web app, here's how you build a web app, and we're going to give you the tools that you need to do that. We're not going to just throw our hands up and say, someone else solve this problem.
And you haven't seen, like, because of that, you haven't seen the same kind of like explosion around like CSS and JS solutions like React has, where there's 1,000 different choices to go with, but you just kind of use what's built into the framework with Svelte.
Exactly. I mean, you can use all of those CSS and JS things with Svelte, and people sometimes do. I recently have discovered the joy of Tailwind, and
that's a bit different.
It's
right?
a little bit different.
Yeah.
I mean, for a long time I was a real Tailwind skeptic, but like it's one of those things where if you start using it, you're like, okay,
I get it.
I get it.
You wrap your head around it. Yeah.
And so I'm much more pro Tailwind now, having used it, than I was as someone who just looked at Tailwind and was like,
Yeah, but that's different from like a styled component and emotion kind of thing.
All of those things, I mean, you're absolutely right. These came out of just a gap in the market, essentially. Like React had created space for these things to emerge. And that is both a strength and a weakness in my view.
Okay.
It's a strength because if you leave space for innovation and then you let the community come up with these solutions, then you will often come up with some really good solutions. But it's also a weakness because, like, number one, people starting to use that framework, they immediately run into this decision fatigue. Like, which is the best one? And like a lot of people just don't have the time and inclination to really do a deep study of which of these options is most suitable. So they'll do whatever is currently most popular, like people are talking about on Twitter or whatever.
Change it next year.
And then they'll change it next year. But in the meantime, like they are stuck with a solution that may not be the best one. And the other thing is, if you're building something in a more integrated fashion, like if you as the framework team are taking on this problem, then typically you can come up with a much more optimal solution.
Okay.
You know, we have seen with some of the CSS and JS solutions, like a lot of them, especially the early ones, they just weren't very good. They brought some nice developer ergonomics, but they resulted in some really bad performance characteristics. And that is not a problem that Svelte users have ever had. Like, we haven't had this thing where, you know, you use a thing and then 2 years later, everyone's like, you fool, why are you using that thing? Because we took it upon ourselves to think about that problem on behalf of the people using the framework. And, you know, opinions can differ about the relative merits of leaving space for innovation versus providing people with the tools that they need to do their jobs out of the box. But my instinct, it definitely leans more towards the, you know, this is a problem that someone has to solve, and it may as well be us rather than all of the people who are going to use the framework.
What was the initial problem that made you want to write the first lines of Svelte?
It was more a sense of shame than anything, if I'm honest. Svelte is not my first front-end framework. Right. Years and years and years ago, I started a project called Reactive, which was one of the like early 2010s era of frameworks, like back when people were using Backbone. Angular had just come onto the scene. React did not yet exist when I started building Reactive, nor did Vue. And it was essentially, you know, one of the template-based solutions to the problem of describing interactive user interfaces. And at the time, it was like pretty novel. You know, had some good ideas, and it gained some usage. You know, I think Delta Airlines used it at one point. I remember discovering that Playboy TV were one of our users. Like they
have
raised an
great
issue
user experiences, famously.
Exactly. So it did get used, although not particularly widely, and that's probably for the best. It's, you know, like anyone's first attempt at a major open source project. I made a ton of mistakes in building that, and so even though we had a pretty tight little community around it, and people enjoyed using it, it had some pretty serious flaws, particularly in terms of performance and the amount of JavaScript that it would add to your application. And at the time I was working in the news industry, where these things are very important. Typically, if you're building interactive applications that are embedded inside news articles, which was my job at the time, you need to worry about performance, and you need to worry about the amount of JavaScript that you're sending, because you're already on a page with analytics and ads and like all of this other stuff. And so like you've really got to like try and minimize the amount of damage that you're doing. And Reactive was doing quite a bit of damage, I came to realize. And so the initial impetus for Svelte was like, can I atone for my sins by making something like Reactive, but which is much faster and which involves much less JavaScript. And at the time, I've been building a module bundler called Rollup for a couple of years, and I've been dabbling with at the time it was popular to build ES6 to ES5 transformers, and so I'd built one of those, and so I felt like I had a pretty good understanding of how the compiler world operates. Like you take some input and you turn it into an abstract syntax tree, and then you generate another output from it. Like that's what Rollup and these ES6 to ES5 transformers do. So I was in that kind of headspace. So between these two things, I was like, maybe there's a way to solve the front end framework problem by using compiler techniques. Instead of thinking about like how can we have the most efficient framework runtime, what if we just reposition the idea of a framework as, instead of being some code that runs, it's just a way of structuring your code. It's just a way of thinking about how you architect your application. And as part of your build process, all of that just kind of melts away. And so it began really as a kind of experiment in whether that was feasible, whether that would work. And because of Reactive, there was sort of a ready-made community who was ready to come and help with that project. And that's how it got its start 7 and a bit years ago. Wow.
Yeah, so you were already in that like compiler mindset. You were kind of a hammer seeing everything as a nail.
Yes.
And so that explains why you were able to look at UI frameworks in a different way than anyone else was, because you were just like, compilers. Like, let's just...
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that we were the only people thinking in these terms, but I think we took that idea much further than anyone else. Like people were definitely thinking, oh, I have some JSX and these bits never change. Maybe I can hoist that to the top of my module and then I can make the diffing process more efficient. And Angular had a concept of ahead of time compilation, which, it wasn't as extreme as Svelte just completely turning it into, direct DOM manipulation code. It's still like this intermediate representation, but it's the same process of trying to do more work at build time so that you can do less work at runtime. Right. In the same way that it's beneficial for the framework team to take on problems that the user base is going to have to solve eventually. It's better if when you're building the application once, you're doing work that then doesn't have to happen by each of the users who download the app and run it in the browser.
So you mentioned that Reactive, Rollup, and Svelte were all created in newsrooms when you were solving problems kind of on the ground there. Does it help to innovate when you have those on-the-ground problems and you still feel like you have those?
I definitely think that it helps when you're trying to come up with these solutions. Like the phrase constraints breed creativity, or whatever the phrase is. Like there is a threshold that you have to meet when you're building something that is going to be used in that environment where the page where you're deploying your app to is like a hostile environment, and so you need to clear a certain bar, but also like you're working in an environment where you have very tight deadlines that are non-negotiable because it's the news, and so you can't have situations where like, oh, I need to fix this bundler configuration issue, or like, oh, I need to spend 4 hours optimizing this thing because the naive way of doing it happens to be slow because of how the framework is architected, or something like that. Yeah. So there are definitely these challenges that you just have to face when you're in that situation. And what I think we've learned over the years is that if you can do that, if you can meet the bar of being able to create something very quickly in a very time crunched environment that is still going to work effectively on people's mobile devices and so on, then you've probably done something that is going to work in a lot more cases as well. And so initially people looked at that heritage and they were like, oh, so it's useful for building these very small self-contained things, but like it probably doesn't scale to real world
apps and whatever.
And it turns out that's just not true. If you can make web development simpler for the simple cases, then like in most cases, you've also made it simpler for the hard cases. And so I think the success of Svelte, to the extent that it has been a success outside of newsrooms, is testament to the fact that if you start with these hard problems, then you're also solving the same problems that everyone faces outside that environment.
Do you still see some of that newsroom DNA in Svelte?
Yes, there definitely is some. I think part of that is in the things that we prioritize as a framework, which includes things like transitions and animations and things like that. Because very often when I was building these things, I'm building explanatory graphics that need to walk you through a process of some sort, and very often that will involve transitioning from one state to another, and typically frameworks just kind of don't solve that for you. But for me, I felt it was important that transitioning between states is actually a first-class responsibility of the framework. And so there are elements like that which definitely hint at its newsroom origins. But I think also just the fact that Svelte is, or at least tries to be, a very easy framework to work with, because a lot of the people who do the job that I was doing in newsrooms, they're not programmers for the love of JavaScript, right? Yeah. They're programmers because that is the most effective way to do the job of telling the story that they need to tell. And so, a lot of people candidly just don't have time for the front end industry's bullshit. Right? We don't want to spend time thinking about configuration and optimization.
More complexity in order to,
like, which library am I supposed to use for state management? No, it should be built in. Like, I just want to get the thing and start using it immediately and not have to be burdened by these dozens of micro decisions that candidly some frameworks do make you solve. And that, I think, is sort of a core tenet of Svelte's philosophy today still, and it's one of the things that I think our users appreciate.
So you don't have time for bike shedding when the deadline's tonight.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. If there is a sensible decision, and sometimes there need to be escape hatches. Sometimes we need to say, okay, if you have some very specific requirements that aren't part of what we anticipated, then sure, here's the escape hatch, go nuts. But for most of the time, for most of the user base, you can just use the stuff that's built in.
Do you have an internal metric for when you roll your own package versus when you use some other tool that already exists? What's that bar for you?
It's not something that I don't know if I could quantify it. Yeah. I suspect I personally am a little bit quicker to roll my own than a lot of people. I really appreciate knowing exactly how the sausage is made. And very often if I'll use a dependency for something and it feels like it's what I want, but then down the road I find myself fighting with it. And I've had that experience enough that I tend to, I think I recognize the signs that, this is going to be annoying to future me, so I'm just going to take on the burden now and just build something myself. Also, it's just kind of fun to make stuff. Yeah. And so there are a few examples inside Svelte. For a very long time, we used a library called CSS tree for parsing CSS inside Svelte components. And in Svelte 5, we've got rid of that in favor of our own CSS parser. Okay. Because it turns out that for what Svelte needs, we don't need to have rich, detailed information about this string represents this kind of color with these values. We don't care about that. We just need to be able to identify the selectors inside your CSS and things like that. So we can build a much, much simpler version of the thing that otherwise, you're installing something from NPM, it needs to be able to support a much wider array of use cases. And so if you have a narrow use case and all of the things that are out there, just by virtue of the fact that they are libraries, support a much wider array of use cases, then it's very often the case that you can make something that's much more tightly focused and much more appropriate for your task. There are other examples. We have our own AST traversal library. We use a thing called ZimmerFrame, which we built for Svelte 5. We have our own code generation library. It's called ESWrap, which is ES, but also parsed backwards. Because you take an AST and then you generate code instead of having a code and then generating an AST.
That's nice.
And so we have all of these little utilities which are technically independent projects, but they are hand-rolled solutions to problems that we faced while building Svelte, and for us they are better than the solutions that you can find out there on the internet. So yeah, I don't know that I could say there's an internal metric exactly, but as soon as I get the spidey sense that we can do better,
it's an intuitive thing.
Then we just go ahead and we do it.
It seems like signals is the current idea that frameworks like Solid, Svelte, Vue, Angular are all adopting. What do you find compelling about signals that you want to bring that to Svelte?
Yeah, so you use the word current, which would kind of suggest that this is a phase that the community is going through, and that maybe there's going to be a new thing. But I'm actually not sure that's the case. I think that this is more a convergence. Like over time, we've experimented with a bunch of different ways of handling reactivity inside components, and what we've learned is the signal approach is basically the right one. People talk about, like, there's this meme about how you know nature evolved crabs or crab-like forms in multiple species. It's a process called carcinization, and the same thing is happening in the JavaScript framework world with signals. And I don't think it's a fad. I think this is genuinely the right way to think about how you have some change in state represented in a change on the page. And it's not like a new thing. We've been doing this for a very long time. I think Knockout probably deserves the most credit for being the framework that popularized this idea in, like, I think it was 2008 when it came out. But over recent years, it's definitely the work of Solid and its creator, Ryan Carniato, who have evangelized this idea and really made people understand the benefits. And those benefits are essentially that you get a really easy to reason about fine-grained reactive system. And what I mean by that is you can have a component that references a whole bunch of different pieces of state, and maybe it contains components inside it with their own state and all of that. And in the world that React popularized, where you have this thing called the virtual DOM, and when you have a state change inside a component, what happens is that function reruns, and then you compare the old with the new, and then you change out the bits that have changed. Like, that involves a fairly coarse-grained approach to updating your page. And it's not so much that diffing the before and the after is expensive as that you need to keep rerunning all this code. And it's very easy for performance issues to creep in over time. The signal approach is, I think, a lot simpler. Instead, you generate these components once, and then all of the holes in the component where the state exists, those things are the bits that update when the values change.
Got it.
And so instead of re-rendering an entire component, or in the worst case, an entire application, you really are making these very targeted updates to the things that have changed. And different frameworks have tried to solve this in different ways over the years. Svelte had a sort of hybrid approach where it was a top-down system like React, but with instead of diffing the JSX, it would diff the data that was coming into the component, and it would maintain knowledge of which thing had changed, so that we could early out if you have an if block that references some state that we know didn't change, then we just don't check it at all. So there were these optimizations to make Svelte 3 and 4 fine-grained-ish, but Svelte 5 is truly fine-grained because it adopts the same signal idea that is now so prevalent in other frameworks. What we do differently is around the ergonomics of using signals. Up until this point, frameworks that use signals have had to sort of present you with this layer on top of your data, which is, I think, a little bit awkward. Like, you can't just reference your data directly. You need to either call a function, or you need to access some property of a proxy or something like that. And it kind of really gets in the way of just thinking about the stuff inside your app in terms of the raw data. But because we're a compiler, we can have the best of both worlds. We can give you that nice, direct interface to your data, but also have all of the reactive magic that allows things to update in this very seamless and fine-grained way. So that's the benefit for us, and we haven't shipped it yet. This is the in development Svelte 5, but from what we've seen so far, we get really good results. Like, it is incredibly fast on all of the benchmarks. We do really well. Scores well in terms of memory usage, in terms of component creation, in terms of updates, like all of these things. It turns out it's just a very, very good way to think about managing state. To the extent that there is now a cross-framework group of people who are looking at how we can add signals to the language itself.
To JavaScript.
Okay. So I don't think I'm revealing any like
You heard it here first.
No, this is an effort that I think some people are broadly aware of. Because all of these different frameworks are essentially reinventing the same primitives from first principles, there's this idea that it would be better if this existed in the language itself in some form.
As you said, like with CSS and Svelte solving that, if just JavaScript solved it for all the frameworks, and then they could solve it for all the users.
Exactly.
Okay.
And once you've solved all of those common problems, then you can focus on the things that differentiate the frameworks.
Right.
You can differentiate on like user experience and developer experience and the feature set that you include in the framework and all of those things, rather than everyone spending a lot of time trying to make sure that their signal implementation is like as good as the next person.
Yeah. You recently announced Svelte 5 and runes. Can you talk about runes? What are those?
Yeah, runes are a signal to the Svelte compiler that something is happening. In Svelte 3 and 4, we would kind of infer your intent from how you'd written your code. If you had let count equals 0, and then inside a increment function you had count plus equals 1, and you were referencing that count somewhere inside your template, then we would say, oh, this count variable, this is a piece of state. This is a reactive piece of state that when it changes, we need to update something. And so the compiler would instrument the assignment. When you do count plus equals 1, it would also call a function that said to Svelte, oh, hey, this component needs to update. And by the way, inside this component, the thing that has changed is the count. And so that's how we got that pseudo fine-grained reactivity. And that feels like pretty nice and ergonomic, but it means that you're restricted to having that reactivity at the top level of your components. Right? You're not going to start creating state inside let declarations generally. And so immediately we have this sort of, you work inside .svelte files and you're in this sort of magical reactive land and it feels really nice. But then if you have some logic that exists in a JavaScript file, you don't get to benefit from any of that. And so we had this second way of thinking about state, which we call stores. So inside components, you use component state. Outside components, or if you need to share something between components, then you use this whole other system of managing state. And we really wanted to get away from that. We wanted to have a way that you could say, inside an arbitrary function, oh, this is a piece of state. And beyond that, this is derived from these other pieces of state. And we also wanted to have a way of saying this code should run whenever any of the things referenced inside it changed. And typically these are referred to as effects in signal-based systems. And also non-signal-based systems like React has use effect and so on. And so we spent a very long time thinking, how can we solve all of these problems that we want to solve? We want to have signal-based fine-grained reactivity. We want to have the really smooth developer ergonomics. We want to do count plus equals 1. You don't want to do set count parens plus 1 or count.value plus equals 1. Like, that sucks. And we also want to be able to have a single unified model, both in your Svelte components and in modules that are shared between Svelte components. And after trying some outrageous number of design ideas, like I think we tried 50 or so different ideas,
wow.
We eventually settled upon runes as the ideal way to communicate to the compiler that you're creating a piece of state. And what a rune is when you're using it, it just looks like a function call. Yeah. So instead of doing let count equals 0, you'll do let count equals $state parens 0. And as far as like TypeScript is concerned, that's just the identity function. The thing that you get as a result of that is just 0. So it's still typed as number, and you can still do count plus equals 1. But we have communicated to the compiler that this thing should be treated as reactive state. So when it goes through the compilation process, what's left is let count equals source 0. And then subsequently, every reference to that piece of state, instead of just referencing count, it'll do get count. Which extracts the value from the signal, but also says whatever is currently running is a dependency of this signal. So when it changes, that code will need to rerun. And so that means things inside your template, but also the effects that you describe, right. Those become the dependencies of that signal. And the reason that, that runes made so much sense is that because they just look like function calls, syntactically, you have a lot of flexibility about where you use them. And as I mentioned, TypeScript understands perfectly well what's going on. And so a lot of the other things that we tried didn't satisfy all of those different criteria, but runes work really nicely. And they're not functions that you import from a library. Like you're not importing the $state rune from Svelte. It is just a part of the language. So like you shouldn't think of them as function calls, even though they look like function calls. It's more like you're familiar with the dynamic import construct.
Yeah.
Also looks like a function, but it's not a function. The dynamic import is a special piece of syntax, and runes are the same thing. They are a framework-specific piece of syntax that essentially makes reactivity a part of the language that you're writing when you build a Svelte application. And you can use these runes, state, derived, effect, and a couple of others, inside your Svelte components, but also inside any file that has a .svelte.js or .svelte.ts extension. So instead of having your component state over here and your stores over here, we can start to use a consistent way of describing state inside your applications. And we've tried it in a bunch of different contexts, and it feels really nice.
That's awesome. And so that .svelte.js file is essentially a JavaScript file, but it's one that the compiler flags and goes, aha, I need to do something here.
Exactly. Okay. So you get all of the benefits of writing JavaScript or TypeScript. Like all of your existing tooling works. It works fine with your type checker and like your editor. Like we don't have to invent a new file extension that has like syntax highlighting requirements
or something.
All of that. No, we just get to reuse everything, but just by adding that .svelte.js to the file extension, we're saying to the compiler, oh hey, you want to check this file too.
Cool.
And it in practice that works really nicely because we are creating a new language. This is not JavaScript or TypeScript anymore. This is a superset of JavaScript and TypeScript. And so like initially we thought about just doing that in every JS and TS file. Like everything would go through this Svelte compiler. But like that's kind of naughty because in the same way that .svelte is a language for describing user interfaces, .svelte.js and .svelte.ts, it's a language for describing reactivity.
Okay.
And so that is how we think about it. We are bringing this concept, which all frameworks need to have some version of. Everyone has to solve this problem somehow, and we are saying it's part of the language.
Yeah.
And in our experience, that is just a much more natural way than having some framework-specific API for doing count plus equals 1.
So Svelte's pretty different from React and Vue in a few ways, but I think most notably is that it's compiled, as you talked about. Can you talk about why that matters so much?
It matters a lot less now than it did when Svelte first came out. And if I'm honest, I think we should probably update the blurb on our website because it's candidly a little bit out of date. You know, Vue has a compiler step now, which does a lot of the same work that the Svelte compiler does. React too. The React team has been working on a compiler for a long time, React Forget. And a lot of these ideas have sort of seeped into other frameworks in the same way that we have borrowed ideas from those other frameworks. But the essential difference is that if you can do work at build time that you then don't have to do at runtime, that is going to deliver a better user experience, generally speaking. And so Svelte kind of began as an experiment in how far you can push that idea of doing the work ahead of time. And it turns out there are limits to what you can do with that idea because the compiler needs to understand your code without running it. process called static analysis.
Okay.
And there are limits to what you can do with static analysis. Like everyone's heard of the halting problem. You know, can you look at a piece of code and determine whether or not it will run to completion or not? Like turns out that's an impossible problem to solve with static analysis alone. And we run into some version of that halting problem in Svelte 3 and Svelte 4 around like understanding what the dependencies of a particular piece of code are. And so to us, the compiler difference, the idea of starting from this mindset of we're a compiler, like we can do things that you can't do if you're just writing JavaScript. It essentially expands the solution space in which we operate. So things like Svelte 5's runes are they're a thing that you can do if you're a compiler, and you absolutely cannot do if your starting point is that you're just writing JavaScript or JavaScript plus JSX. And so that's, I think, the essential difference. It's not so much that your capabilities change, it's that the way that you can express ideas in when you're describing a user interface, you have the opportunity to do things in a much more natural and concise way because you've shed yourself of this constraint that this has to be JavaScript. And that's borne fruit in a lot of different ways. And the essential outcome is that when you're writing a Svelte component, it is typically a lot smaller than the equivalent React component or the equivalent Vue component, because like we don't have those constraints. You know, off the cuff, like typically if I'm converting between a React and a Svelte component, the Svelte component is like 30 to 40% smaller. And when you can do that, when you can have that much less code inside your application, the evidence suggests that your application will be more stable. It'll have fewer bugs because the number of bugs increases superlinearly with the size of a code base. And so there are just all of these benefits that flow from that mindset. You can write less code, you can do various optimizations that would be impossible if you were just interpreting the code at runtime. And at least for my taste, you can write things in a more natural and expressive way than if you don't have a compiler.
Unlike other frameworks, Svelte has a backend framework that's built by the same team, yourself, and I'm assuming the same contributors, or like a
very
similar
largely.
team?
There's different people have different focuses, but it's the same team working on both things. Yeah.
Got it. How does that affect what you can do? How like it just feels so different from like the React core team and the Next core team kind of being separate. Yeah. What does that unlock for you?
I think it gives us better visibility into the problems that we're trying to solve.
Okay.
And I think that a similar kind of thing is happening to an extent with React and Next, because like a lot of there is a lot of overlap now. Yeah. Like a lot of the React core team actually now work at Vercel.
Yeah.
I shouldn't say a lot. A few people who are on the React core team work at Vercel and are directly involved in Next. And having the same people think holistically about like the full spectrum of the problem is really beneficial. And we have found that to be the case as well. Like we're able to think, I just think a little bit further than we otherwise could about whether a particular design idea makes sense. Like if we're building something into Svelte, is this something that is going to make sense to a user of SvelteKit? Or like, is SvelteKit having to do a lot of work that should actually be part of the framework itself? And I think the result is that everything just feels a little bit more cohesive and seamless than if you had two distinct teams who, like, you might have really good communication with each other and might have the best intentions of staying aligned, but there's just like a fundamental barrier if the ideas are in separate brains.
Yeah.
When they're in the same brain, then like there is no higher bandwidth communication than like a brain to itself, if that makes sense. Yeah. And so I think that maintaining SvelteKit alongside Svelte has made Svelte a better framework, and I think maintaining Svelte alongside SvelteKit has made SvelteKit a better framework. It's important to us that the two things remain separate.
Okay.
There are lots of people who, for whatever reason, cannot use SvelteKit, but they still want to use Svelte. And that use case is always going to be supported. And like we're very happy for other frameworks to be built on top of Svelte. Like Astro is a great example of a framework that is not built on top of Svelte, but you can use Svelte with Astro.
Yeah.
And a lot of people do that and really enjoy it. And that's exactly the outcome that we want. But we want to have the best possible end-to-end experience for developing websites. And the only way that you can do that, in my view, is if you're thinking about the problem from both ends. And so that's what we try and do.
How do you, what's the line for you determining Svelte and SvelteKit, like a feature falls on this side of the fence or that side of the fence? Like, what's your mental model for them?
So the way that we'll often describe it is Svelte is a component framework and SvelteKit is an app framework.
Okay.
It's slightly unhelpful that the word framework is involved in both. Like sometimes people will use words like library instead, and the semantic contours get a little bit fuzzy. But essentially, if it's to do with describing an isolated chunk of UI, then that is Svelte. If it's to do with server-side rendering, build tooling, code splitting, deployment, routing, like all of that stuff, then that is the application framework. Component framework is probably a little bit outdated now that we're adding stuff to Svelte.js and Svelte.ts files in the form of runes in Svelte 5. Maybe we need to come up with some better terminology that better articulates the distinction, but essentially Svelte is the thing that you use if you want to build a standalone piece of user interface, and SvelteKit is the thing that you use if you want to build an application out of those standalone pieces of user interface.
So what other improvements or changes are coming with Svelte 5?
Wow, so many. I'm very excited about Svelte 5. I think it gets rid of a lot of the pain points of Svelte 3 and 4. And I don't want to be too negative about Svelte 3 and 4 because like a lot of people use them and they love them.
People seem to like it, yeah.
They do seem to like it, but it's...
and they're wrong. No.
Yes, it's actually really kind of frustrating to see people talking about Svelte 3 and 4 when we know that Svelte 5 is going to be so much better, and like, we're just like, I almost don't want to recommend that people use Svelte until we bring out Svelte 5. Because,
stop using it.
I know it's difficult. So we got a lot of things right with Svelte 3, and like Svelte 4 was really just it's the same thing. It's just we just got rid of some junk, but it's basically the same framework, same design. We got a lot of things right. But there are some things that candidly we didn't get right. There are limits to what you can do with static analysis, and people have encountered those limits. For example, statements that rerun when state changes, we put those behind this syntactical construct called a reactive statement, which you use a dollar label, so $:, and then sum equals A plus B, and that will just recompute whenever A or B change. And people really love that, and it's
part of the language. It's a clever solution.
Part of the language, it's a pretty good hack. But the way that works is the compiler looks at that statement and is like, oh, so we're assigning to this thing, so that becomes reactive state. And on the right-hand side of the equal sign, we've got an A and a B. So the code that I generate will update when either A or B change. Well, what if A and B aren't referenced directly in the statement, they're referenced inside a function call?
Yeah.
Well, at that point, the compiler can't see it anymore. And so that no longer works. And there are other quirks that come from that static analysis driven approach to describing these reactive dependency graphs that just don't really work. And there are some other quirks. So because everything is based on assignment, by which I mean it will instrument anytime it sees an assignment expression, like count equals count plus 1 or count plus equals 1. Those are both assignment expressions. It will instrument that. And that works most of the time, but if you have an array and you push an item to that array, nothing will happen.
Yeah.
So we need to tell the compiler.
Equals,
exactly. So you'll have, to-dos.push and then some data, and then immediately below that, in Svelte 3 and 4, you have to do to-dos equals to-dos to signal to the compiler that it needs to update to-dos. Well, that's crazy, right? That doesn't make any sense at all. That is just an abstraction leak. And in Svelte 5, that's no longer the case, because when you create your to-dos states using the state room, it will actually turn that into a proxy or a set of nested proxies so that we can analyze the sets to the children of that. So in Svelte 5, you can do todos.push and it just works. And not only that, but when you reference that further down and you bind a checkbox input to the to-do.done property, you toggle that and it will just update that to do. Whereas in Svelte 3 and 4, because of this static analysis driven approach, the best that we can do is say, oh, something inside to-dos has changed. And so we've just got to like check the entire thing.
Got it.
And it can do that relatively efficiently. Like it caches individual like snapshots of state so that it's not doing unnecessary DOM manipulation. But we still have to check a whole bunch of different things. And that's no longer the case in Svelte 5. So ergonomically, it's better. Performance-wise, it's better. And it's just a more consistent and easier to reason about system. And yet that's not even the stuff that I'm most excited about, because so we have ideas for the world that Svelte 5 will enable.
Okay.
That I kind of don't really want to talk about because they might not work. Like we might try and build it and it's like, okay, no, we thought we could do that and it turns out that we can't. But when you're building on top of this sort of, the word that I'm going to use is immutable, and that's a little bit confusing in this context because like I just talked about how you can toggle the to-do.done thing, and like that doesn't sound very immutable. But underlying that is a system where you're not actually toggling a property. You're essentially running some code. All of that data is immutable in the sense that matters, and when you have immutable data structures, you can start to do some really interesting things that up till now have been out of reach. And so that is some territory that we're very excited to explore post 5.0.
Okay.
And
so like a 5.2 is what we're talking about?
We'll see.
Like,
5.2.
Not like a 6 is what I mean.
That the goal is to start building some of our dream framework constructs on top of the 5 foundation, and then like in 6 maybe like we can shed some of the stuff that supports the old way of doing things, and we also have some big ideas about more effective primitives for doing motion inside components, and there's just a whole bunch of things like that I need to really try and not get carried away with, because we need to ship 5.0 and if we spend all of our time daydreaming about what we can do later, then we'll never ship anything. But like there's a long-term vision for Svelte and SvelteKit that Svelte 5 is kind of the beginning of.
Okay.
We have some pretty exciting plans.
So you just released SvelteKit 2 yesterday, as of this recording. What can you tell us about it? What's different? What isn't?
Mostly it's the same. We were debating whether to do a major SvelteKit release or not at all. The impetus really was that Vite 5 came out, and Vite 5 had some breaking changes, and it's just difficult to support multiple major versions of your dependencies. And so we saw other projects that were updating to Vite 5 and we're like, it would be easier to do a major so that we can drop support for Vite 4.
Okay.
And once we decided that was what we were going to do, we were like, all right, well, when do we do this? And Ben McCann, who's one of the core maintainers of SvelteKit, pointed out that the 1-year anniversary of the launch of SvelteKit 1 was going to be the 14th of December. And so we thought it would be poetic to just like do SvelteKit 2 then. And initially we thought there's really not a lot of work to do here. There's just updating to Vite 5, and maybe there's like a couple of things that we want to get in there as well. So this should be easy. And then as we started going through the issue tracker and looking at the things that we had made mental notes of, saying, oh, we kind of got this slightly wrong in SvelteKit 1, so we should change that for SvelteKit 2. We ended up with this pretty sizable list of changes to make. Mostly these are just like very minor things that most users either haven't encountered or will be able to update very quickly, or in many cases we can even automate it. Yeah. But it ended up being a lot more work than I thought it was going to be.
Just while I'm here, let's get a few of these tickets. And
so it was a fairly sleepless week, but we did it. We got SvelteKit out, and for the most part, it is just a drop-in replacement for SvelteKit 1. There are breaking changes. That's the reason that it is a major version, and so we definitely encourage people to update to the latest version of 1 first, address any deprecation warnings, and then go through the migration script to update to SvelteKit 2. There are some new features. The big new feature that we added in SvelteKit 2 is something called shallow routing. And what shallow routing is a way of associating some arbitrary state with a history entry. Mm-hmm. So the canonical use case that I'll give you is that of a modal dialog box. Often, like you'll do something, Instagram is another use case that is solved by this, but this is like something pops up that you need to confirm or deny or whatever it is. And my instinct whenever I see one of those things on my phone is like, I don't want this, I want to dismiss this. So I'll use the swipe gesture to go back. But if that modal is associated with some component state, like show modal equals true, then when I do that, I'm navigating back through the history stack and I'll go to a completely different page, which is not what I want. So my instincts as a user have just ruined the flow of the application. What you want to do instead is associate that modal state with history. So when you open the modal, you have used the history push state API to add that state to your application. And then when you swipe back, you are just going back and undoing that state change. And until SvelteKit 2, that was really difficult to do. But now it's incredibly easy. You just import the push state helper from app/navigation. And you can push arbitrary state, and it will just get bound to this globally available store that you can use anywhere in your app, and it's a very kind of nice idiomatic way to solve that problem in a way that prevents that swipe back, go to a different page problem that people encounter. But you mentioned the Instagram navigation pattern as well, where if you're on a page that has like a bunch of different photos and you tap on one of the thumbnails, you get a detail view in a pop-up instead of being taken to the photo page. Opinions differ about whether that's a good pattern or not. I think it's quite nice. I think it feels very seamless and smooth. It keeps you in context, but also gives you the information that you're looking for. And that too is a really difficult thing to implement unless the framework supports it somehow. And so with shallow routing, you can solve both of those problems. Cool. And I'm really curious to see what people end up using it for. It's kind of a power tool. And it's not something that you should use for like the bulk of interactions inside your application, but it's for when you need it, it's really useful. There are a few other little improvements here and there. Invalidation of load functions in a SvelteKit app is now more granular if you're changing query parameters. One of the Svelte ambassadors, Paolo, implemented this feature because he needed it, and it's really cool. Like you can change the I don't know, some query parameter that is not a contributor to your data loading process, and we don't need to rerun it anymore.
Nice. Okay.
And so like just little improvements like that mount up to an overall more solid and more polished framework, but which should hopefully feel very familiar to users of SvelteKit 1.
So what are your goals for SvelteKit and Svelte in the next few years? Is it around like market share, adoption, the framework size or complexity?
So adoption and market share is we care about it to the extent that it is an indicator of whether people enjoy using the framework or not. Okay. It is not a goal in and of itself. It's something that, I suppose I do need to be mindful of it because Vercel is paying me a salary to work on this framework, and that only makes sense if the user base is growing. Yeah, exactly. So we do care about adoption, but it is not our primary focus. And if it was, then we would probably make different design decisions. We would do the things that our users were yelling most loudly for, as opposed to the things that we believe is the best long-term bet for the health of the framework and the people who use it. really what we want out of the project is we want to do our bit to try and crisis is a bit of a melodramatic word, but the web is not in great health, candidly. The software industry is also not in that great health. Like, a lot of things that we use in the digital world on a day-to-day basis are just broken. Yeah. I use, apps and devices over the course of the day, and like very often I'm just flabbergasted at how bad they are. Yeah. Like, I try and watch TV and my Chromecasting, like, it'll take 5 seconds to respond. Like, people just aren't building good software at the moment. And it's very frustrating because so much of our world is mediated through digital technology that is, poorly implemented and buggy and all of these other things. And I really love the web, and I care about the web, and I think that it is such an important technology that we need to preserve. And like, as bad as native apps are a lot of the time, I think the web is a lot of the time much worse in terms of user experience and reliability and all of these things. And I want to do my bit to try and reverse that trend. I want to make it easier for more people to build robust web applications that are fast and reliable, code bases that are easy to maintain so that we don't have this descent into bit rot and bugginess. And that's the stuff that I care about. That is the reason that I'm invested in Svelte and SvelteKit, is because I want the web to be a reliable platform for people building complicated apps, and I want as many people as possible to be a part of that. Like, I don't think that front-end development should be the preserve of like this sort of priesthood of people who are able to deal with all of these arcane framework concepts and this like proliferating set of platform APIs. Like, it should be much easier to build good, robust software than it is today. And that is why these projects exist. That is why I am still motivated to work on them after working on Svelte for 7 years. And if we increase adoption and market share as a result of those, then that's great. But it's not our main focus.
So it's more of a mantra than a metric, would you say? Like, it's more about like a holistic kind of like, I want to achieve this with the framework rather than what are the numbers at?
Exactly. We, to the extent that I can talk about the team having a particular culture, I think it's true. I think that there is a shared culture on the Svelte team. We are pretty suspicious of metrics in general. Like, a lot of benchmarks are kind of nonsense when you actually look into them. And a lot of the things that web developers fixate on, like Lighthouse scores and Core Web Vitals, like, these are useful diagnostic tools, but they are terrible metrics because they are so easy to game, and because the results that you get vary so widely based on the problem that you're solving as opposed to the tools that you use to solve it with. And so we don't disregard metrics. We pay attention to metrics, but we never let them control our decision making. We think that's a really unhealthy thing that unfortunately is quite prevalent in our industry. And we resist that. We are thinking as far as possible in terms of first principles and like a long-term vision of the way that things should be, instead of focusing on numbers.
Yeah, it makes sense, because just thinking back after you said that, I don't see a lot of numbers around SvelteKit. You kind of you frame it as like, a simple framework, or like you'll talk about it more in the experience, less so than the like 10 times faster than something else.
Because those numbers never exist outside of a context.
Yeah, a vacuum.
Like, people will often talk about things like Lighthouse scores, which is like a reasonable way to measure the first load experience, but tells you nothing about the experience of actually using an application once it's loaded. And so there's just these huge blind spots in the ways that we talk about these things today, that maybe we could solve them with more measurements, but I don't think we can. I think we need to solve them with a focus on just like paying attention to the things that we're building and thinking deeply about what a user actually wants to experience, as opposed to what these numbers are trying to tell us. So yeah, we are a very qualitative and judgment-driven framework.
In 2015, you made Rollup, right? And then around like 2018, you handed it off to a maintainer. Then Evan Yu comes along, grabs Rollup and ESBuild and builds Vite from that essentially. And then you come back and you build SvelteKit on top of Vite as essentially a Vite plugin. Is that accurate?
It is, yeah. It
So,
is a Vite plugin.
yeah, how does it feel to kind of have like your old work kind of come back as foundation for what you're building these days? Is that, yeah, like how's that feel?
I mean, it feels nice to know that this thing that has so taken over web development, Vite has so completely taken over the way that people build front-end projects these days. It feels good to know that I can claim like a tiny share of the credit in that.
Well, Vite has 4 packages, or like 4 main dependencies. It's ESBuild, it's Rollup, it's PostCSS, I think, and like 1 more for handling file management. So like it's, yeah, I'm not saying you built Vite, but at least it's kind of a substantial part of what makes Vite tick.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not trying to like project false modesty or anything, but like the truth is, yes, I started Rollup, but most of the credit for Rollup does not belong to me. It belongs to Lucas. He's been maintaining that, not single-handedly, but he's been doing the lion's share of the work for many years. And it is a much better project in his hands than it ever was in mine. But yeah, it is nice. It does feel good to know that that thing that I did back in 2015 to scratch my own personal itch, which was, at the time, the options were basically Browserify or Webpack, and both of them had some very high costs for the work that we were doing. Again, like in newsrooms, we're trying to minimize our bundle size as far as possible, and the bundlers at the time were pretty inefficient about how they bundle stuff. And with the advent of JavaScript native modules, I saw an opportunity to do things in a much more optimal fashion. And so like it was born out of this scratch my own itch, take advantage of this change in the landscape, and just like throw it over the wall and see if other people find a use for this too. And people did. And it's always surprising to me to see which things land and gain an audience and which things just don't. And Rollup just happened to be this thing that served a need that existed at the time and has just kind of become this thing. And it always reminds me that if you have a problem, it's very possible that other people have the same problem. And so like just share your work and just see what becomes of it. And that's just a really great thing about our industry, is that you can do that. Like we have this open source culture, and I appreciate the fact that I am now one of the beneficiaries of past me's decision to do that. And I encourage people to do the same thing. Like you never know how useful something is going to be until you just add it to the commons.
So you joined Vercel about 2 years ago. What has changed since you've gone full time? And like, can you like walk me through like a brief like day in the life of Rich Harris? Are you kind of off on your own working on Svelte and SvelteKit with the Svelte team? Are you in lots of Vercel meetings, kind of working on marketing strategy there? Like, what are you doing?
So it's been transformative for the project. I don't know that we would have managed to get SvelteKit done without having full-time engineers working on it. It's so for people who are using Svelte and SvelteKit, it has been a very positive change. In terms of like what our day-to-day looks like, so there's 3 of us now who work at Vercel full-time on SvelteKit.
Simon.
Myself, Simon, and Dominic.
Cool.
And we pretty much just work on Svelte and SvelteKit. Obviously, being at a company like Vercel means that there's a lot of cross-pollination with people working on other problems. Like we talk to the next team from time to time, and we share notes on things. But to a very large extent, we are focusing just on the open source project, which is really great. Like we get these long uninterrupted periods in which we're able to think through problems in a way that wouldn't be possible if we were still doing it on like a evenings and weekends volunteer basis. And so it's been a very positive change for the framework. It's also been a very positive change for me, because prior to joining Vercel, I was doing a more than full-time job at the New York Times, and then I was like trying to contribute to this project in my free time, and like I don't have a lot of free time, and so it meant that the velocity was kind of reduced, and it also just meant that I don't want to say that I resented working on the project, because I absolutely didn't. It was like it's always been a hobby and a passion, but it's hard to justify spending serious chunks of time when you're also trying to have a life outside work. And so my work-life balance is still not great. I probably spend more time working in front of my laptop than I should, but it's infinitely better than it was before. So it's been a win all round, and hopefully it's been a win for Vercel too, having the team that builds Svelte like as part of the crew, because a lot of Vercel customers use Svelte and SvelteKit, and it's nice for those people to have kind of like a direct line to us when they need it, but also like the reassurance that that there is a long-term support for the thing that they're building their business on top of.
The official documentation and tutorials and everything of Svelte and SvelteKit are honestly like no other framework that at least I've learned. Like you have examples on there that save me from like 80% of my Google searches. The tutorial takes you through like step by step in an interactive way, teaching you both Svelte and SvelteKit. What is your philosophy around educating developers?
When someone is new to a project, there is a barrier that they've got to overcome, and that maybe they're interested and motivated in learning how to use your thing, but the chances are they're just like mildly curious. And if the first thing that they have to do is clone a Git repo or install some CLI or whatever it is, or like read some documentation and then like try and apply it to their own situation, like you've already lost, you've already failed. And I really believe that the way to do this is to make it interactive and to involve people in a way that has zero friction. And I learned this from Knockout. Back in the day had this, maybe it wasn't the first of its kind, but it was the first example that I saw of a front-end library that gave you an interactive web-based tutorial where you didn't need to install anything. You could just start going through this tutorial in a web browser. And it was great. It was so cool. And so when we launched Svelte initially, we had a similar thing where you have these interactive tutorials that like, you go through these self-contained steps. Like you're not building a whole application. You're just doing a self-contained exercise. So you don't need to maintain context over a long period of time. And you learn one concept. And there's like 300 words that you read, and like a tiny bit of code that you add. It's like, oh, I understand that concept now. And just like pedagogically, that is a much better way to get concepts into a person's brain. When we came out with SvelteKit, we had a bit of a problem though, because the old Svelte tutorial was based on this sort of Rube Goldberg system of like, we had this web worker where we would run Rollup inside a web worker, and the Svelte plugin was part of that system. And every time you typed a keystroke, we would send the updated set of files to that web worker, and it would compile your app, and that would appear on the right-hand side. That's great for Svelte as a standalone thing, but you cannot teach a full-stack framework like SvelteKit in that manner, because you need a server, and you need a server running inside a web browser. Like, how the hell do you do that? At the time that we were thinking about this, we had seen some really interesting work come out of StackBlitz. StackBlitz is one of these companies that gives you like an in-browser IDE, and they developed a technology called web containers. And web containers is super cool. It's basically Node compiled to WASM, running inside a service worker inside your browser. It's like this crazy mad science stuff. And we saw this and we were like, yo, we could use this to build an interactive SvelteKit tutorial that runs inside the web browser. And so we started talking to the StackBlitz people, and we worked really closely with them over a long period of time and said, look, this is what we want to do. Your technology seems like the solution. And they were like, great, this is like a perfect test use case. We're going to support you in every way that we can. Cool. And so we had this really productive partnership where we used their technology and like help dog food it and refine it. And now when you go to learn.svelte.dev, you are running SvelteKit, you're running Vite, like on a node server inside your browser, and it means that we can teach you all of the concepts that go into SvelteKit, all of the like the server-side rendering and like all of these things, the data loading, all of that stuff. It just works inside this self-contained context, and people don't need to install anything. They can just go to this website and start learning. And like even for me, like I forget sometimes what the APIs look like, or I need to refresh my memory, and I don't need to, like I can just go to this tutorial. Or if I need to explain something to someone, I can just send them this link. And so it's been hugely beneficial. And massive kudos to StackBlitz for creating this technology and doing it in such a way that such things are possible. And exactly what we hoped would happen is starting to happen. Angular now has a tutorial very similar to ours, which is also built on web containers. Nuxt is working on something that is very similar to ours. And so I hope that this is just the new norm for how we teach these concepts. Like, don't make me jump through hoops. Just let me learn the thing without having to learn all the things I need in order to learn the thing. And it's been honestly great. It's been very well received. It doesn't work on iPhones at the moment because we get out of memory errors, and I'm not sure how we're going to fix that. But for most people, most of the time, it's like a really cool solution. And I encourage everyone out there to steal that idea. It turns out it works pretty well.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, just for like beginners, getting stuff running in the terminal can be a hassle, right? So like if they can just do it right in the browser, that's such a great way for them to learn and to pick up something new. So that's fantastic.
And also make it disposable. Like if I'm following this tutorial and I get a little bit lost or confused, then like don't put me in a situation where I now have something that's slightly incorrect committed to my repo on my. Just reload the page, and you get a blank slate. And because they're all short and self-contained, like you can do that. You
or
don't
like
need
you
to
make a mistake 5 steps ago and you don't even know you did, and it snowballs.
Exactly. So learn.svelte.dev sort of encapsulates our philosophy on pedagogy and on like how you teach these things. I actually did a whole talk on this a couple of years ago in Amsterdam, describing like what you can learn from the best teachers. Like what are the lessons that the best teachers can teach us about the best way to teach people, and we try to apply those in learn.svelte.dev. And I'm sure there are lots of ways in which it could be improved, but I'm really happy with how that turned out.
It's a good step in the right direction. I mean, I think it's part of why Svelte is consistently rated among the best user experiences on surveys. Like you're pretty much always like 1 or 2. Do you have like some secret sauce other than the tutorials for like how do you know that a certain change you put in is going to be like delightful for users? Yeah, like how have you maintained that status of a super delightful framework year after year?
I think there's a couple of things. Number one is stay dumb. Like a lot of programmers are kind of drawn to complexity. They have like this kind of sick, sadistic relationship with complexity. It's like, oh, if it's complex, then that means that
I'm smart.
I'm smart, or if it's complex, then it must be better than the simple thing. And that's not generally true. I consider myself a fairly unsophisticated programmer. Like if I see something that's complex, I just nope out. Like my brain just doesn't deal well with complexity. And so if something starts to get to be like spidey sense, like we shouldn't put this in. And I think that is a sentiment that is shared by other people on the Svelte team as well. And the other is like have the gumption to say no to your user base frequently, because people will often come to you with very reasonable feature requests. And they'll say, wouldn't it be great if the framework could do this? Like I have this use case and it would be solved by doing this. And I definitely, when I was starting out in open source, had the instinct of saying, oh yeah, I mean, that's totally reasonable. We should do that. But the cumulative effect of saying yes to all of these disparate feature requests is that you end up with this sort of Frankenstein of like, you call it scenario solving.
Or it's like if everyone's throwing toppings on a pizza, it starts to get a little weird.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Toppings on a pizza is a really good metaphor, actually. And over time, like I personally, and I think as a team, we've got much better at saying, you know what, I understand why this is important to you, but I don't think that us adding this is going to be good for the long-term health of the framework. We're just going to like let this seep for a while, and we're going to look at all of the other issues that people are facing. And if you do that, and if you're patient, then very often what you'll find is that you come up with a solution that solves multiple use cases at once. And you do that by just taking a step back and seeing like, what is the deeper problem here? Don't attack the symptoms, attack the cause. And like that's really what Svelte 5 is all about. It's like we have spent the last 4 years looking at these symptoms and thinking, you know, what is the underlying cause? And now we're fixing the underlying causes. And that's not a thing that you can easily replicate. It's not like a piece of advice that you can give to other open source maintainers, but the muscle that you need to develop in order to get to that place is saying no.
Got it.
And it's difficult and it's uncomfortable, and like often people will be like, well, I'm not going to use this thing, I'm going to go and use some other thing, and that's hard. Like, oh no, I really care
You need
about
to keep
like
that person. He was
yeah,
interested.
please don't leave.
Yeah.
But that is the thing that you have to do in order to have like a long-term cohesive vision that survives, you know, multiple generations of users, because users come and go, and that's fine. Some will stick around for the long haul, but like ultimately, you know, people will fixate on very specific minor use cases, and over the long term, that's not the way to design a framework.
Do you remember any of the names that you almost used instead of Svelte? Like, is there like a napkin around your apartment somewhere with all the name ideas jotted on it, like framed? No?
There's no napkin. I remember the naming session. I don't remember the names. So this was like a long time ago, and we're in the offices at the Guardian where I worked at the time. And I was like, yo, I built this thing, like here's what it does. I need to come up with a name that is available on NPM, first of all, but also has all of the right connotations. And we spent a lot of time thinking of different things.
Like, is that like,
exactly. That could have been
you just
one of them.
whiteboarded all of these?
Yeah.
And that's taken.
And like one of the criteria, I wanted a single syllable word.
Okay.
And I don't remember what the other ideas were, but I remember that it was my friend Keenan Davis. He has the credit for coming up with the name Svelte.
Okay.
Just like threw it out there, and it
Just free merch for life?
felt really good immediately. Like, yes, that's it. I didn't realize at the time that a lot of people don't believe Svelte is an actual word, particularly non-native English speakers, but also a lot of native English speakers are like, they think that we just made it up, and we didn't. It is a real word with real connotations. It means lithe and athletic and graceful and all of these things that we want to convey when we're talking about the framework. But people think that it's just like a thing that we made up, and it's not. So yeah, I wish I could remember. Maybe there was some gold in there, but Svelte is what we landed on, and I think it's held up pretty well.
Yeah, caught on.
Like we have a brand that I think is pretty well known at this point, and it all starts with a good name.
Yeah, it's and a good logo, good solid color. Why is there no SvelteKit logo though? Like you have the same S, right?
We do, yeah. That is part of our desire to make the two things feel like two halves of the same whole that can be used independently. I mean, you can't use SvelteKit without Svelte, but you can use Svelte without SvelteKit. And we thought that if we had a separate logo, for one thing, like designing a good logo is really tough.
Yeah.
But for another, it's just nice if the two things really do feel harmonious and connected, and that is why we did that.
All right, Rich, thank you so much for having me. Talking with you was fantastic. I learned a lot, and yeah, this was a great time.
Yeah, thank you. This is fun.